Your child needs a father, and my heart needs you." Those words echoed in the warm wind that swept through the streets of Copper Ridge, like a promise few men would have the courage to make. The sun punished the dry land with the same intensity with which it punished the souls of those who dared to dream of something other than survival. Samuel Hartwell walked down Main Street with measured steps, each footprint kicking up a small cloud of red dust that clung to his worn boots. The sheriff's badge on his chest reflected the cruel light of noon, but his grey eyes seemed to carry the weight of all the storms he had ever faced. 38 years of life had taught him that some battles were fought not with weapons, but with decisions that a man had to make alone in the silence of his own conscience. Widow Margaret Thompson stood on the porch of her white house, watching her 6-year-old son play with wooden soldiers in the thin shade of a lonely tree. The boy looked up as Samuel walked by, and for a moment the sheriff saw there the same hunger that he himself carried, not for food or water, but for something that would give meaning to the days that dragged on under that unforgiving sky. Margaret held her breath as Samuel stopped in front of her estate. She knew he came there every day, always at the same time, always with the same expression of someone who carries a secret too heavy to share. William Thompson had been gone for 3 months, never to return, leaving only a tombstone in the cemetery and 2 people trying to figure out how to move on. The sheriff took off his hat, revealing brown hair where a few grey strands were beginning to appear at his temples. His calloused hands swung the brim of his hat as he searched for words that could express what he felt without sounding like another man trying to take advantage of the vulnerability of a grieving woman. But Margaret Thompson was not just any woman, and Samuel knew this from the first day he saw her defending her property from men who thought a widow would be easy prey. The wind blew harder, making Margaret's blue skirt dance, and bringing with it the smell of mugwort and broken promises. The boy abandoned the toys and ran to hide behind his mother's skirts, but his curious eyes remained fixed on the tall man who wore a star on his chest and seemed to know all the secrets of the world. Samuel put his hat back on his head and waved slightly before continuing his walk. He knew that it was not yet the right time for the words that burned in his chest like red-hot iron. Margaret needed time, and he learned to be patient the hard way possible, burying people he loved and discovering that some wounds never heal completely, only teach a man to live with pain. The afternoon advanced with the characteristic slowness of days in the desert, where time seemed suspended between the promise of dusk and the implacable reality of heat. Samuel knew that soon the usual problems would begin to appear. Drunks in the saloon, disputes over land, desperate men making choices they would regret in the morning. But for a few precious minutes, he allowed his mind to wander to a future that still seemed impossible. A future where those words he carried in his heart finally found the right moment to be spoken. The badge weighed down on his chest as a constant reminder that a sheriff couldn't afford to daydream for long. Justice in the West waited for no one, not even for men who had learned to love in silence and to wait with the patience of one who knows that the best things in life cannot be forced, only cultivated like rare flowers in barren soil. Margaret remained on the porch until Samuel disappeared around the bend in the street, and only then allowed a sigh to escape her lips. She also carried unspoken words, feelings that grew like wild plants in her chest, stubborn and stubborn, refusing to wither even under the weight of grief and uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring. The night brought with it more than just relief from the scorching heat. It also brought the desperate cries of Margaret Thompson echoing through the deserted streets of Copper Ridge, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. Samuel jumped out of bed before he was even fully awake, his sheriff's instincts speaking louder than the need for sleep. When he arrived at the Thompson estate, he found Margaret in the backyard, hugging her crying son in her arms. The boy had a red mark on his face, and Margaret's eyes shone with a fury Samuel had never seen before. 3 men on horseback walked away in the darkness, their silhouettes dissolving into the night like dastardly ghosts. Samuel didn't have to ask what had happened. The signs were there, the fence knocked down, the cattle scattered, the window broken in the house. It was the third time in 2 weeks that someone had tried to intimidate the widow into selling her land for a fraction of the real value. But this time they had crossed a line that should not have been crossed. They had touched the boy. Margaret looked up as Samuel approached, and he saw something there that made him stop halfway. It was not fear. It was pure determination, the kind that is born when a mother realizes that she needs to protect her child at any cost. She held a shotgun with hands that trembled not with terror, but with pent-up rage. The sheriff examined the mark on the boy's face carefully, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for more serious injuries. The boy stopped crying and looked at Samuel with a confidence that broke the man's heart. It was as if, at that moment, the boy instinctively knew he was safe. Samuel helped Margaret put her son to bed, and then the two sat in the kitchen in silence, drinking strong coffee as the reality of the situation weighed down on them like a stone. Margaret knew that the men would return. They kept coming back, and the next time, maybe they wouldn't be content with just scaring. The sheriff studied the woman's face in the dim light of the lamp. Margaret Thompson was 32 years old, but the last few weeks had left marks that went beyond time. Still, there was a tough beauty about her, the kind that doesn't break easily. She was the kind of woman the West respected, strong, determined, able to weather storms without bowing her head. Samuel made a decision that he knew would change everything. He got up from his table and walked to the window, watching the darkness outside. He knew that the men who had been there were henchmen of Harrison Burke, the richest man in the county, and also the most dangerous. Burke wanted the Thompsons' land because he had discovered signs of groundwater on the property, something more valuable than gold in that dry region. When Samuel turned to face Margaret, she saw something different in his eyes. Cautious patience had been replaced by an iron resolve. He wasn't just the kind sheriff who passed by his house every day. He was a man who had faced evil before and knew exactly how to deal with it. Margaret realized that something had changed between them that night. The invisible barrier that had kept Samuel at bay had been broken the moment he saw his son's tears. She understood, without a word being spoken, that he would not let anything happen to them. It was a silent promise, sealed not with words but with the determination that shone in his grey eyes. The sheriff checked all the windows and doors before settling into the porch rocking chair, his gun resting on his lap. Margaret protested, saying that he did not need to spend the night there, but Samuel only shook his head. Some compromises did not need to be discussed. They were simply taken over by men who understood what it meant to protect what mattered. During the long hours until dawn, Samuel thought of the words he had not yet spoken, but which now seemed more urgent than ever. Margaret Thompson and her son were not just people he admired from a distance. It was his responsibility now, not just as sheriff, but as a man. And Harrison Burke was about to discover that some men don't back down when the people they love are in danger. The sun rose, painting the sky red, and Samuel knew that it would be a day unlike any other. Things at Copper Ridge were about to change, and he would be the catalyst for that change. Margaret appeared in the doorway with a cup of fresh coffee, and when their eyes met, they both understood that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. From that moment on, they would face together whatever fate brought. The confrontation came with the midday sun, relentless as ever. Harrison Burke arrived at Copper Ridge on a black horse that was worth more than most men earned in a year. Behind him, 6 armed men rode in formation, their guns shining in the cruel desert light. It was the kind of show of strength that worked with most people, but Samuel Hartwell wasn't the majority of people. The sheriff was waiting in the middle of Main Street, planted like an ancient tree that refuses to bend even under the most violent storm. His hands rested naturally next to the weapons, and his grey eyes studied the newcomer's every move with the patience of an experienced predator. Burke dismantled with the arrogance of someone who always got everything he wanted, but something about Samuel made his confidence waver for a moment. Margaret watched from the window of her house, her heart beating like a war drum. The son was hiding in the basement, as Samuel had instructed the night before. She knew that the next few minutes would determine whether they had a future in Copper Ridge, or whether they would be just two more victims of the greed of powerful men who thought money could buy anything. Burke spoke first, his voice carrying the false authority of those who buy loyalties instead of winning them. He offered money for Margaret's estate, a sum he considered generous, but which Samuel knew was a fraction of the real value of the land. The sheriff did not immediately respond. Instead, he let the silence stretch out like a rope being stretched to the breaking point. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice cut through the hot air like a sharp blade. There were no direct threats or unnecessary bravado, just simple, clear words that made it clear that Margaret Thompson was under the protection of the law, and that any attempt to intimidate her would be met with all the force that justice allowed. Burke smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. The rich farmer then made a fatal mistake. He mentioned the boy, suggesting that accidents could happen to children playing too close to disputed properties. It was like lighting a match near dry powder. Samuel took 2 steps forward, and something in his eyes caused Burke's men to instinctively bring their hands to arms. But the sheriff knew men like that. He knew that behind the arrogance and expensive weapons there were only cowards who depended on fear to get what they wanted. He had faced real gunmen, men who killed out of necessity or for a crooked code of honor. These were different. They were mercenaries who would flee at the first opportunity if the price got too high. Margaret saw the exact moment when the situation changed. Samuel didn't have to draw his gun. His mere presence, the way he positioned himself, the unshakable certainty in his movements were enough to plant the seed of doubt in the minds of Burke's men. They had come hoping to intimidate a helpless widow, not to stand up to a sheriff who was clearly not afraid to die for what he believed in. Burke tried to save face, making more veiled threats and promising that this would not be the last conversation between them. But his words rang hollow in the dry desert air. Samuel just nodded, as if he were accepting an invitation to a duel he knew he would win. The rich farmer remounted his horse with less graceful movements than when he had arrived. When the riders disappeared into the dust, Samuel remained in the middle of the street for long minutes, letting the adrenaline slowly dissipate from his system. I knew Burke would come back, but next time it would be different. The man had been publicly humiliated, and men like him had not forgotten this kind of affront. The next time would be with more men, more guns, and less talk. Margaret left the house and walked up to Samuel, her footsteps echoing in the now silent street. When she got close enough to see the sweat on his forehead and the tension still present in her shoulders, she completely understood what he had risked for them. It wasn't just his job as sheriff. It was something much more personal and much more dangerous. The boy appeared running from the basement and hugged Samuel's legs, who placed a gentle hand on the boy's head. At that moment, Margaret saw the man behind the badge, and her heart was filled with gratitude, mixed with something deeper and more frightening. It was admiration, but it was also love, the kind of love that grows slowly and then explodes like a fire in the dry desert. Samuel looked at Margaret and saw in her eyes the reflection of his own feelings. The words she carried in her heart seemed less heavy now, as if the storm she had just passed had cleared the air between them. But he knew it wasn't the right time yet. First, I needed to make sure they were safe. Then, if he was still alive, maybe he could finally say what he felt. The afternoon moved on with the deceptive tranquility that always follows great storms. But Samuel knew he was just the eye of the storm. Burke would return, and when he did, it would be for a war that would only end when one of the two could no longer fight. Harrison Burke's revenge came like a firestorm in the early hours of the 3rd day. 12 armed men surrounded the Thompson property, but this time they found more than they bargained for. Samuel had spent 2 days organizing the defense, and half of the honest men of Copper Ridge were hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to act. The shooting began when the first of the invaders tried to set fire to the stable. Samuel had foreseen this tactic and strategically positioned men to protect each building on the estate. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night like dry thunder, and Margaret hugged her son in the basement, whispering prayers she had learned from his mother years before. Samuel moved through the darkness like an experienced ghost, his gun speaking only when necessary, each shot calculated to disable without killing when possible. He knew that some of these men were just desperate people looking for work, not real criminals. But when he saw two of them trying to force his way into the house, all compassion vanished from his heart like mist under the scorching sun. The battle lasted less than an hour, but it seemed like an eternity to everyone involved. When silence finally returned to the desert, 4 of Burke's men were wounded, 3 had fled, and the others surrendered when they realized they were surrounded by citizens determined to protect one of their own. Burke had remained cowardly aloof, waiting for others to do the dirty work for him. Samuel found Margaret and the boy emerging from the basement, their faces pale but relieved. The boy ran to him without hesitation, and when Samuel lifted him in his arms, he felt something break definitively in his chest. It wasn't just protection she felt for that family. It was fatherly love for the boy, and something much deeper for Margaret, a feeling that had grown like underground water, silent but powerful. The sheriff knew Burke wouldn't give up easily, so he made the decision he knew was necessary from the start. He rode alone to the rich farmer's large house in the early hours of the morning, when the dew still covered the barren ground like tears of night. He found Burke drinking expensive whiskey on the terrace, trying to drown the humiliation of defeat. The final confrontation between the two men took place without witnesses, only them and the eternal wilderness as judge. Samuel did not need to use violence. Sometimes the truth was weapon enough. He knew about Burke's illegal dealings, about the stolen cattle, about the forged contracts. A visit to the federal judge with the right evidence would be enough to end the empire built on lies and intimidation. Burke understood that he had lost more than one battle. He had lost the war against a man who fought not for money or power, but for love. It was the kind of defeat that men like him could never fully comprehend, because they didn't understand that some things couldn't be bought or stolen. Samuel offered a simple choice: leave Copper Ridge for good or face federal justice. When Samuel returned to the Thompson estate, he found Margaret waiting on the porch, her son asleep in her arms. The sun was rising, painting the sky gold and pink, colors that seemed to promise a new beginning. She looked at him and saw in his eyes that it was all over. Burke was gone, and he would never return. Samuel approached slowly, taking off his hat as he always did. But this time there was something different in his gestures. Respectful caution had been replaced by a quiet certainty. Margaret placed her son on the porch swing and stood, his heart beating like bird wings attached. The sheriff stopped a few steps away from her, and for the first time in months she didn't have to search for words. They were there, simple and true, waiting only for the right moment to be released. The desert around them remained silent, as if even the wind wanted to hear what he had to say. Margaret saw in Samuel's eyes all that he had kept during so many days of waiting and silent protection. It was gratitude, but it was also a promise. It was admiration, but it was also commitment. It was the kind of look a woman gets only once in her life, if lucky enough. The boy shifted on the swing, still asleep, and Samuel looked at him with a tenderness that made Margaret's heart tighten. She understood at that moment that the words he carried were not just for her. They were for both of them, mother and son, a promise of family and future that she had thought was lost forever. The sun rose higher, bathing the porch in golden light, and Samuel finally found the courage to say the words that would change their lives forever. Margaret held her breath, knowing she was about to hear something that would change everything, something worth all the moments of fear and uncertainty they had faced together. Samuel took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into uncharted waters. The badge on his chest seemed to weigh less at that moment, as if all the responsibilities in the world had come down to those two people on the porch. Margaret waited, her fingers clasped in front of the blue dress that the morning wind made dance softly. The words came out of Samuel like water, finally finding a crack in the rock. He talked about the last few months, about how he had learned to know her heart through small gestures and silent looks. He talked about the boy, about how he had felt something awaken in his chest when he saw the boy play alone in the shadow, needing a father figure to guide him through the difficult paths of life. Margaret felt warm tears stream down her cheeks as Samuel said the words she had secretly hoped to hear. They were not grandiose declarations or impossible promises. They were simple truths about a man who had learned to love a family that was not his by blood, but that had become his by choice. He talked about building a life together, about teaching the boy to be a good man, about giving her the security and companionship she deserved. The boy woke up to the sound of voices and rubbed his eyes, confused to find the two adults talking so seriously on the porch. Samuel knelt at the child's height and explained in simple words that a 6-year-old boy could understand that he would like to be part of his family. The boy looked at his mother, then at Samuel, and asked the most important question of all, whether that meant he would have a real father. Samuel's response came loaded with emotion that he did not try to hide. He told the boy that it would be an honor to be his father, that he would teach him to shoot, to ride, to be just and courageous. He promised that he would always be there to protect them, not only as sheriff, but as the man of the family. The boy smiled and threw himself into Samuel's arms, sealing a deal that was worth more than any legal document. Margaret watched the scene with her heart overflowing with a happiness she had thought was lost forever. When Samuel looked up at her over the boy's head, she saw there the future she had not dared to dream of. It wasn't just love that shone in those grey eyes. It was commitment, responsibility, and the silent promise that they would never again be alone against the storms of life. The ceremony took place a week later in the small wooden church that stood at the end of the main street. All of Copper Ridge attended, because weddings were rare in the desert, and this particular one had been born out of a story that everyone had witnessed. The pastor talked about true love and second chances, but his words seemed unnecessary to those who knew the journey that had brought these three people there. The boy wore new clothes and held the rings with the seriousness of someone who understands the importance of the moment. When Samuel put the ring on Margaret's finger, she felt the symbolic weight of the promise they sealed not only between them, but with the future they would build together. It was more than a wedding. It was the formation of a family forged in adversity and tempered by true love. Samuel officially adopted the boy on the same day, giving him his surname and all the rights of a legitimate son. When the judge asked the boy if he accepted Samuel as a father, the answer came loud and clear, echoing through the walls of the small room as a declaration of pure joy. Margaret cried, but they were tears of happiness, the kind that washes the soul and leaves room for new dreams to grow. The Thompson estate became the Hartwell estate, and with it came the discovery that Samuel had suspected from the beginning. Groundwater was even more abundant than Burke had imagined. Within months, they were selling water to neighboring farms, turning that barren land into one of the most prosperous in the region. Samuel remained sheriff, but now he returned home every night, knowing that there were people waiting for him. The boy learned to call his father naturally, and Margaret discovered that love does not diminish when it is divided, but multiplies in ways that defy all logic. They had other children in the following years, but the first always held a special place in Samuel's heart. Copper Ridge grew up around the Hartwell family, thriving on the water that gushed from their land, and the stability that came from having a sheriff who fought for justice, not power. Samuel became local legend, the man who stood up to Harrison Burke and won not with violence but with courage and true love. Years later, when Samuel's hair was completely grey and the boy had grown into a tall, strong young man, Margaret still remembered that first day on the porch, the words he had spoken about his son needing a father and his heart needing her. had become the foundation on which they had built a lifetime. The wilderness remained unrelenting as ever, but the Hartwell family had found their own oasis of happiness amid the barren expanse. They learned that some love stories don't start with burning passion, but with mutual respect, and grow slowly until they become something unbreakable, resistant like plants that can flourish even in the driest soil. And when sandstorms came, as they always did in the West, they faced them together, knowing that they had found something more valuable than gold or silver. A family built on true love and protected by a man who had learned that the greatest courage lay not in standing up to gunslingers, but in opening one's heart to love without reservation. If this story of love and courage in the heart of the desert has touched your soul like the warm wind sweeping across the plains, you can't miss the next adventures the Wild West still has to tell. Stories of men and women who braved the barren wilderness with only their determination and the strength of their hearts for company. Subscribe to the channel to follow each new journey through the wilds, where justice was born from the closed fist, and love flourished even under the most relentless sun. And leave your comment below telling what was the moment that made your heart race the most in this saga of Samuel and Margaret.